What would you do if life took everything from you? Your husband, your child, even your reason to believe, and then handed you a key to a cursed house no one dared to enter? When Grace Miller, a grieving widow, adopted 2 orphans, a German shepherd, and an abandoned cabin in the snowy town of Bozeman, people whispered that she'd lost her mind. But sometimes, the things the world calls haunted are simply waiting for someone brave enough to love them back. Tell us in the comments, do you believe love can heal even the coldest home? Snow drifted down in soft spirals over Bozeman, the kind of snow that swallowed sound and slowed time. Grace Miller stood before the cabin, her gloved hand brushing snow from the faded sign. For sale, $100. The world around her was still, a silence so deep it almost felt alive. People in town called this place cursed, said strange things had happened here, that no one stayed longer than a week. But Grace had learned that some curses were only stories told by those who had never lost everything. She looked over her shoulder at the old pickup where Naomi and Eli waited. Naomi, 10, with eyes older than her years, pressed her hand to the frosted window. Eli, 7, bounced his knee to stay warm, his laughter faint and hopeful. Beside them, Ranger, their German shepherd, lifted his ears and let out a soft whine, as if sensing both danger and destiny. Grace turned back to the house. "This is it," she whispered. "Our new beginning." By late afternoon, the papers were signed, the keys cold in her hand. They drove up the snow-crusted hill and parked before the sagging porch. The steps groaned beneath their boots, each creak echoing like a question. When Grace pushed open the door, a gust of air escaped, heavy with the scent of pine and old dust. They found an empty room with cracked wallpaper and a fireplace filled with ash. Grace set down their few belongings, a blanket, a bag of food, and a single candle. "Home," she said softly, though the word trembled in her mouth. That night, the candlelight wavered across the walls, painting golden shadows that seemed to move when no one did. Naomi leaned her head on Grace's shoulder. Eli curled up beside Ranger, who kept his eyes fixed on the dark hallway beyond. Outside, snow pressed against the windows. Inside, for the first time in years, Grace felt something gentle, not joy yet, but the memory of it. Then, without warning, a faint sound came from above. The groan of wood, the slow hinge of a door. Grace's breath caught. The attic door had opened by itself. A rush of cold air swept through the room, snuffing out the flame. Darkness fell. She looked up into the blackness, her breath turning to silver mist. For a heartbeat, she thought she heard footsteps overhead. Light, measured, almost human. But when she stood to listen closer, there was nothing. Only silence. And yet, something about the house felt suddenly awake. Morning came pale and quiet, the kind of gray dawn that felt half asleep. The house, once hollow, now hummed faintly with life. Grace woke before the children, wrapped in a blanket on the floor beside the unlit fireplace. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the faint creaks of wood, the steady rhythm of Ranger's breathing, and the soft sigh of wind moving through the old frame. The night before had unsettled her, but there was something oddly tender about it too, as if the house had simply wanted to announce its presence. When Naomi stirred, she moved with the careful grace of a child who had learned too early not to make noise. "Mom," she whispered, though she'd started calling Grace that only recently. Grace smiled faintly. "I'm here, honey." As the morning light reached through the broken shutters, Naomi wandered toward the corner of the room. Something glinted beneath a pile of old newspapers. She knelt, brushing away dust, and found a small tin box, tarnished but intact. The lid bore an engraving. "Home is where we are brave." Inside lay a sepia photograph, a family of 4, smiling on the same porch they now called theirs. The mother's hand rested on the head of a German shepherd that looked almost identical to Ranger. Grace's breath caught. It wasn't fear, more a feeling of recognition, like meeting a memory she didn't know she had. She handed the photo to Naomi, whose eyes widened. "They had a dog like ours," the girl whispered. Grace nodded. Maybe he protected them too. That evening, the temperature dropped. The wind rose, whistling through the cracks in the walls like voices trying to be heard. Ranger lifted his head and barked once, sharp, alert, then again, staring down the dark hallway. Grace grabbed her flashlight, her heart quickening as the beam cut through the dust. Nothing. Only a folded blanket had fallen from a high shelf, lying in a pool of moonlight. She stepped closer and caught a faint scent of lavender, old but comforting. Naomi appeared beside her, sleepy-eyed yet calm. "It's not cold anymore, Mom," she murmured. Grace looked around. The air, though icy outside, felt strangely warm within. Somewhere in the quiet, the house seemed to breathe. Slow, steady, alive. By mid-morning, the snow outside had softened into a quiet drizzle, and Grace decided to paint the kitchen, not for beauty, but for warmth. The walls were cracked and pale, like bones left too long in the cold. As she ran her roller across the surface, the old paint flaked away, revealing faint marks beneath. Then, at the corner near the window, her brush caught on something rough, a thin seam in the plaster. Curiosity stirred. Grace set the brush aside and pressed her fingers along the uneven edge. The plaster gave way easily, crumbling to reveal a folded piece of paper tucked deep inside. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but still legible. She unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear what time had nearly erased. The handwriting was delicate, looping, the kind used by women who once wrote letters instead of texts. It read, "If anyone finds this, please, let this house live again. Let it be filled with love, not sorrow. For houses die when hearts inside them do." January 3rd, 1953. Margaret Hensley. Grace froze. Her throat tightened, and before she could stop it, tears welled in her eyes. The letter felt less like a message from the past than a whisper meant for her alone. "Let this house live again," she repeated softly. It was what she had wanted since the day she turned the key in the door. When Naomi and Eli came running in, she showed them the letter. Naomi read each word aloud in her small, careful voice. Eli listened, holding Ranger's collar as the dog wagged his tail, sensing the shift in the air. "Was she like you, Mom?" Naomi asked. Grace smiled faintly through her tears. Maybe she was someone who believed love could still heal broken walls. That afternoon, the three of them worked together. Grace scrubbing the counters, Naomi wiping dust from the windows, Eli dragging a small pot of soil to the porch. They planted 2 green saplings side by side, their roots shivering in the frosty ground. Ranger lay by the doorway, watching like a guardian who finally trusted the world again. By sunset, the house no longer felt like a stranger. The kitchen smelled of fresh paint and earth, and the air hummed softly with life. Grace stood in the doorway, the letter pressed to her heart, and for the first time, she felt that someone, long gone, had passed her the torch to begin again. The storm came without warning, a white wall swallowing Bozeman whole. By dusk, the roads were buried, and the wind screamed through the pines like a living thing. Inside the cabin, the lights flickered twice, then died. Darkness settled thick and complete. Grace's instincts sharpened instantly. The nurse in her never truly gone. She lit a candle, its small flame trembling in the draft, and turned toward the couch where Naomi lay. The girl's face was pale, her skin hot beneath Grace's trembling hand. Fever, rapid pulse. Grace felt her chest tighten. "Mom?" Eli's voice was small, frightened. He clutched Ranger's fur. "It's all right, sweetheart," Grace said softly, though her heart was pounding. "She just needs care. We'll keep her warm." She gathered every blanket in the house, wrapping Naomi tightly. Then she soaked a cloth in snow melt and pressed it gently against the child's forehead. The air was so cold her fingers burned, but she worked calmly. Sponge, measure, whisper, wait. Her motions automatic, the quiet discipline of a woman who had once fought to keep lives from slipping away. Outside, the wind howled like memory, of hospital corridors, of faces she couldn't save. "Not again," she whispered. "Please, not again." Ranger stood by the door, restless, tail low, eyes gleaming with urgency. He barked once, sharp, decisive. "No, Ranger," Grace said. But he barked again, louder, then pawed at the door. Grace met his gaze, that same fierce, knowing look she had seen before, and understood. She leaned down, cupping his face. "Go," she said softly. "Find help." The door opened, and Ranger vanished into the storm. Grace turned back to Naomi, checking her breathing, whispering lullabies between prayers. Eli sat beside her, holding his sister's hand, while Grace counted each heartbeat aloud, anchoring herself against fear. Hours passed, her voice hoarse, hands raw from cold. Then faintly, through the blizzard, came the echo of a bark, distant but real. Grace lifted her head. Headlights pierced the snow outside, red and gold like dawn breaking. A patrol truck crawled up the hill, siren muffled by the storm. Two rescuers burst through the door, following the sound of Ranger's cries. They moved swiftly, checking Naomi's vitals, wrapping her in thermal blankets. One man turned to Grace, his breath visible in the freezing air. "We were about to turn back," he said. "Then we heard your dog." Grace dropped to her knees as Ranger stumbled inside, his fur caked in frost. She gathered him close, tears mixing with melted snow. "God sent you," she whispered, her voice breaking, "so we wouldn't have to lose anyone else." Outside, the wind still roared, but inside, the light of the candle flickered back to life, steady and warm. The days after the storm passed in slow, tender motion. The kind that makes people breathe differently, softer, as if afraid to disturb the quiet miracle that had just happened. Naomi recovered quickly, her fever fading like a bad dream. Grace spent her mornings sitting near the window, watching the sunlight melt the heavy snow, thinking of how close she had come to losing again, and how love, once more, had chosen to stay. Eli, ever curious, followed Ranger around the house as they continued their little discoveries. One afternoon, while Grace repaired a window frame, she heard his voice from the living room. "Mom, there's something here." His small hands were reaching into a crack near the floorboards. With Ranger's nose nudging beside him, he pulled out a small wooden box, carved with a delicate pattern of leaves. Inside, wrapped in brittle paper, was a sheet of music. The ink had faded, but was still legible. "Song for the Living," composed by M. Hensley, 1952. Grace felt a shiver run through her. The name, Hensley, the same woman from the letter. Naomi's eyes lit up. "Can I try it?" she asked softly. In the corner of the parlor stood an old upright piano, its keys yellowed, some chipped, but still worked. Grace nodded. "Go ahead, sweetheart." Naomi sat down, hesitating for a moment before pressing the first key. The sound was thin at first, then steadier, clearer, like a voice remembering how to sing. Eli sat cross-legged on the rug, Ranger beside him, tail wagging in rhythm. Grace closed her eyes, letting the melody wash over her. The tune was simple, wistful yet full of light. And as it filled the room, something uncanny happened. The wind outside hushed. Snowflakes that had been falling since dawn seemed to pause mid-air, hovering in stillness. For a moment, the whole world seemed to listen. Later that week, word spread through Bozeman about the house that sang. Neighbors began to visit, bringing blankets, homemade pies, and bunches of winter flowers. They didn't come out of curiosity, but out of warmth. The cabin that had once been whispered about in fear was now spoken of with affection. A place reborn, where kindness found shelter, and where the past and the living met in song. By late January, the snow around Bozeman had begun to soften, though the air still carried the crisp bite of winter. The little cabin on the hill, once feared and abandoned, now glowed at dusk, its windows lit with golden warmth, laughter spilling out into the cold. A local journalist came one morning, camera slung over her shoulder, cheeks pink from the wind. She'd heard the stories, the house that sang, the dog who led rescuers through a storm, the widow who turned loss into life. Grace hesitated at first, modest and shy of attention, but the reporter's eyes were kind. "People need hope," she said. "Maybe your story could give them that." The segment aired a week later on Bozeman's local station, and by evening, messages poured in from across the state. Strangers sending letters, knitted scarves, even old books for Naomi and Eli. Some wrote simply to say that they too had lost someone. But after hearing Grace speak, they'd felt something stir again. Grace never saw herself as a symbol. She was just a woman trying to make sense of grief. But now, her home had become a refuge for others. With help from the St. Luke Community Center, she began a small class for children who had lost family during the pandemic. On the first day, she set out mugs of cocoa and crayons on a long table. Naomi played the old piano softly in the corner, while Eli built towers of blocks with the younger kids. Ranger lay near the fire, his head on his paws, tail wagging every now and then. A quiet guardian of peace. Grace looked around the room, the laughter, the music, the smell of cinnamon from someone's cookies, and felt her chest tighten, not from sadness, but from a fullness she hadn't known in years. That evening, when a local station asked her for a closing statement on air, Grace spoke softly, her voice steady as snow. "Miracles," she said, "don't come down from heaven. They happen right here, in the way we choose to love each other, beneath the same roof. Through every winter we survive." Outside, flakes began to fall again. Not as a storm this time, but as a gentle reminder that even the coldest seasons can bring warmth if the heart remembers how to give it. A year had passed since the storm that nearly stole Naomi's life. The cabin on the hill, once a place of sorrow, now carried the warmth of belonging. With the help of neighbors, volunteers, and the St. Luke Community Center, Grace had expanded the small home into something greater. A new wing had been added beside the old cabin, simple, sturdy, and full of laughter. They called it the Haven of Hearts, a shelter for children who, like Naomi and Eli, had lost everything but still deserved a chance to begin again. Grace still worked part-time at St. Luke's, but most of her days were now spent here, teaching the children, tending the garden, and baking bread that filled the air with cinnamon and safety. The little family had grown. There were now 6 children staying through the winter, their boots lined neatly by the door. Naomi, now 11, helped Grace read bedtime stories to the younger ones, her voice soft and short. Eli, 8, had learned to help his mother with the dogs, training them gently, just as Ranger once protected them all. On weekends, volunteers from Bozeman brought supplies and music lessons. Naomi practiced her piano each afternoon, her fingers still small but graceful, playing Song for the Living. The sound carried through the snowy air like a lullaby, drawing smiles from anyone passing by. Grace often stood by the window, watching the children play, snowball fights, sled rides, endless giggles. For the first time, she felt peace not as an absence of pain, but as the presence of love renewed. That evening, as the first snow of the new winter began to fall, Naomi sat beside her mother by the fire. "Mom," she asked softly, "where do you think Dad and my brother are now?" Grace looked into the fire's golden light, her face calm. "They're here, sweetheart. In every fire we keep burning, and in every heart we keep warm." Naomi smiled, leaning against her. Outside, the house glowed gently, not grand, but alive. A home reborn from loss, shining quietly in the snow. There are stories we tell to heal, and others that heal us as we tell them. Grace's home began as a shelter from grief, but became proof that miracles are not lightning from heaven. They are quiet choices we make, day after day, to love anyway. Perhaps your own life, too, holds a small miracle waiting to awaken, in forgiveness, in kindness, in the courage to begin again. And when you share light, it multiplies. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment, share it, and subscribe to help us spread hope to others who may need it tonight. May God bless you and keep you warm, in spirit, in faith, and in love that never fades.